Good afternoon, everyone. We have an energy crisis every single decade, and we all play a very important role in that. It's not a matter of if it'll happen again, it's just a matter of when. But I think the next energy crisis is probably not what you're thinking. And if you remember anything from my talk here today, the next crisis is not going to be one of shortage. It's going to be one of abundance. Energy is one of our largest expenses as a society. In fact, if we look at energy costs as a percentage of after-tax income, the average American spends close to 20% of their after-tax income on energy. This is the cost of powering your home and your transportation. For lower-income Americans, it impacts them even more and can exceed 70%. Furthermore, energy is a major impact into the products that we buy and enjoy every single day. And in some industries, it can account for as much as 75% of the production cost. Now, I was talking just about 6 weeks ago to a group of folks who were looking to build a new glass manufacturing facility that would employ 90 people. And when I asked them, what's the number one consideration on where you'll locate this site, their answer was simple. It was the cost of electricity. So if electricity and energy play such a major role into our household budgets and our industry budgets, then what's the trend on the pricing? This plot shows the average retail electricity rates as indexed back to 2005. And we can see some seasonal fluctuation, but the trend is pretty clear. It's upwards and to the right. Energy is becoming more expensive. So then, what does the future look like? Well, as a thought experiment, I'd like you to consider the implications if the cost of energy goes to zero. What would you do with 20% of your income returned back to you? What happens to the costs of goods and services if 75% of their production costs just goes away? What changes in the world when energy becomes free? So why do I get excited thinking about this? Well, first, just a little bit of background. When I was doing my PhD at the University of Arkansas, I, like many, was struggling to figure out what I actually wanted to do when I grew up. Here I am in 2005, showing up at orientation for the microelectronics and photonics program at the University of Arkansas. Here I am, just a few years later, defending my PhD. Exact same mop of blonde hair, but now I at least owned a suit. But it was 2009 that something happened that changed my life forever. And this was my new beginning. See, I took a class taught by Dr. Carol Reeves in the Walton College of Business. And the premise was very simple. Have an idea, write a business plan, and start a company. This is when I first started focusing on the energy space. And working with an amazing team set the foundation of what would become Picosolar. And it's been a pretty wild ride. The team won the MIT Clean Energy Challenge. We were invited to close the NASDAQ in New York. And then, as Barry mentioned just a few weeks ago, we were one of very few companies to ever receive 3 rounds of support from the Department of Energy's Sunshine Incubator. Now, this has made me incredibly fortunate because I've had the opportunity to spend the last 6 years focused on the energy space and seeing the technology trends that are shaping the industry in real time. Now, I'm asking you to consider the implications of the cost of energy going to zero because I believe we'll be there soon. So what happens? Well, first, the really easy one, our electricity bill goes away, so we can tear that up. But that's not entirely true because the transmission cost is still significant, even if production goes to zero, but we'll come back to that here in just a minute. But energy-intensive processes, like desalination of salt water, instantly become much more affordable and easy to deploy. So this has ramifications for agriculture, or if you happen to be an arid climate close to salt water. Now, other energy-intensive industries, metalworking, cement, glass, all the things we just talked about previously, or in the fantastic talk we just heard from Anna Kilani, even the production of our clothes, all become a lot more economical. And what's even more interesting is suddenly the location for manufacturing becomes decoupled from the local electricity rates. So now you can put manufacturing closest to demand. Manufacturing is going to be in for a pretty wild ride, and I think we all stand to benefit tremendously. Now, digging a little bit deeper, with the electrification of our vehicle fleet, suddenly the cost of ground transportation becomes much cheaper. If electricity is free, then the cost per mile is trivial. Now, the Tesla Model S and the Nissan Leaf are some of the better selling electric vehicles, but it set the stage for all major manufacturers to follow suit. This isn't limited to our consumer vehicles either. Walmart recently unveiled a hybrid truck concept, and the electrification or partial electrification of our trucking fleet further reduces the costs of goods and services. If we start mixing in self-driving vehicles, things only become wilder. So what about real estate and the costs of rent? This graph shows the average home sale price and cost per square foot plotted against the BART public transportation system in San Francisco. And we all know that real estate is all about location, location, location. And one of those locations is typically distance from your job. But what if it's not? If the cost of ground transportation is trivial and your commute turns from a road rage-inducing fight against traffic to a completely passive endeavor, does it matter if it's 10 minutes or an hour, especially if it saves you $1,000 per square foot on your purchase price? What other considerations become more important than just the distance from your job? Will this have unintended consequences? Absolutely, but it's something that we'll all have to think through. So why am I taking your time talking about a future that's completely opposite than what we saw in the opening slides? Well, we've now introduced an innovation cycle that's typically measured in months and years to an industry that's used to thinking about things in terms of decades. If we look at the waves of innovation that have occurred over the centuries, it's obvious that they're coming faster and they're getting steeper. Advanced energy is set to become a very big deal. So let's just take one example, and as you can imagine, solar is my favorite. This graph shows the cost of solar plotted against the cumulative production. And as you can see, you get a fairly linear decline down towards zero. What's most exciting about this graph, however, is that it's a number of years old. Today becomes yesterday, and we find ourselves with solar literally being one of the cheapest forms of energy generation on the planet. It's funny because these innovation cycles have really started messing with the poor guys that have to do the market predictions. So imagine yourself for a second showing up for work in the late 90s and your boss tells you, I need you to predict the growth of renewable energy. And so you look at what's happening today and you make your best guess. It turns out you were wrong, and when you have to come back to it the next year, you have to revise it. And then next time you come back to it, you were wrong again, so you had to revise it. And this trend just keeps continuing. And at some point, you pretty much just start drawing straight lines that become increasingly vertical, whatever you can justify without laughing to yourself. But the reality is even crazier. It's exponential growth that's built upon a sustained growth rate of 41%. Now, human minds just have a hard time sometimes comprehending exponential growth. And so just a really quick illustration. If you imagine in your heads a piece of paper, right? You fold it in half, it doubles in thickness. You fold it in half again, it doubles in thickness. Now picture in your mind, how thick would that be after 25 folds? How about 45 folds? Do you have a picture in your head? Well, check my math after the talk. But by my math, after 25 folds, it's roughly the height of the Empire State Building. And by 45 folds, it reaches the moon. That is exponential growth, and that's exactly what's happening in the advanced energy sector. For instance, if this trend continues in solar, it only takes 6 more doublings to get to 100% of our energy use. Is that going to happen in 12 years? Probably not. We're always going to rely on a mix of energy, but it is absolutely going to change how we produce and consume power. So what do the folks who have a vested interest in traditional forms of energy think? Well, this is a report put out in part by Shell, where they too see that solar, shown in yellow, is going to become one of the dominant forms of energy generation on the planet. Now, those of you with good eyes will notice that the time scale, as well as the sheer amount of energy that we're going to use, is a little alarming. But the trend is undeniable. But more importantly, where are we today? Well, so just to give you a little context, Here's a summary electric report from Ozark Electric for a relatively large house up in northwest Arkansas. And I picked this house, one, because it's large, so it uses a lot of electricity, and it's all electric, so you capture both the heating and the cooling. Now, there's not a huge surprise here. The usage is highest in the winter and the summer when you're cooling and heating and cooling respectively. And as Barry mentioned earlier, there's really only two things you care about as a homeowner, and I've highlighted them here. It's how much energy you're using as measured in kilowatt hours, and how much you're being charged per kilowatt hour. In this example, it's right around 9 cents per kilowatt hour. And that's relatively consistent in Arkansas. Now, on a national average, it's around 12 cents per kilowatt hour, just for reference. So we're fortunate to have relatively cheap electricity here in Arkansas. So if it costs us, as the consumer, 9 cents per kilowatt hour, what does it cost the utility to purchase at wholesale or generate it themselves? So the EIA has an annual survey where they break it down by fuel, maintenance, and operational cost for all the different sources. And there are people that will argue for days around other costs that should be included in here, but this gives us a good baseline. Hydro always comes out ahead on these things for a number of reasons, but unfortunately we're limited in how much and where we can deploy it. If we look at the other sources, we can see they range from roughly 2.5 cents per kilowatt hour up to just over 4 cents per kilowatt hour. So if we have a different type of energy generation that can come in around 2.5 cents per kilowatt hour, it's immediately competitive with the more traditional forms of electricity generation. So 2.5 cents per kilowatt hour. Remember that number because it may come up again shortly. So where is solar today? Well, just recently, a company called Hecate Energy set a world record in Palo Alto with a power purchase agreement at roughly 3.7 cents per kilowatt hour. So what this means is there's a company willing to build a large solar plant and sell electricity at 3.7 cents per kilowatt hour. And that price is fixed for at least the next 20 years. Now this number is important, one, because 3.7 cents is competitive with all the other sources that we just saw, and it's fixed for the life of that contract. So we don't see any of that upward movement over time. Now, notice the date on this article, February 23rd of this year, so roughly 8 months ago. What do you think happened 3 months later? In May of that year, so just a few months later, a new world record was set. This time it was at 2.99 cents, let's just call it 3 cents per kilowatt hour. And many of you are probably thinking, well, that's great, that's just a bunch of folks willing to lose money to set world records. But you would be wrong. One of the principles on this project explicitly stated, there is no value in winning without margin attached. Trust me, there is margin. So this is a group of folks who are generating power at less than 3 cents per kilowatt hour, and everyone is making money. It's a pretty phenomenal thing. And this is the point of my talk where I was going to have to stop and say, well, 3 cents per kilowatt hour is pretty close to 2.5 cents per kilowatt hour, and trust me, we'll get there soon. But guess what happened last week? If you guessed a jaw-dropping new world record, well, you should probably quit whatever you're doing and be a soothsayer, because that is pretty amazing. But that's exactly what happened. If we ignore the ad in the bottom right that thinks that I'm interested in giant monitor lizards invading Bangkok, and just look at the date for a second, this was just last week, September 19th, and the price was a jaw-dropping 2.42 cents per kilowatt hour for this bid. So these are a group of folks who are going to build a plant, sell electricity at under 2.5 cents per kilowatt hour, cheaper than anything else available, and they're going to make money doing it. To me, that's pretty amazing. But we've talked a lot about the price side of things. What about the additional value added? Advanced energy sources like solar arguably have some additional benefits that are hard to account for. The Department of Energy, a usually pretty conservative group, looked at reducing water usage, curbing pollution, and mitigating the effects of climate change. And they pegged a value of 3.5 cents per kilowatt hour that's accrued to all of us as a society for solar-generated electricity. Now, this is an area that will be debated for many, many years, but using their number, and let's just focus on the US for just a second. Admit it, we love to just focus on the US every now and then. we have a world record bid of 3.7 cents per kilowatt hour. And we have an additional value created of 3.5 cents per kilowatt hour. So that means our all-in costs on this project as a society is 0.2 cents per kilowatt, 0.2 of a penny per kilowatt hour, quite literally an order of magnitude lower than what we're used to. Now, as an engineer by training, I'm the first to admit that there's some fuzzy math here. And folks are going to debate for many, many years what the value is of curbing pollution and the effects of supposed climate change. But the trend is undeniable. We're moving towards a zero marginal cost electricity society. So that brings me to an important point. So where exactly is the crisis? Well, the challenge in this case falls to a fairly regulated group of individuals, our good friends, the electric utility. Now, the utility's business model is incredibly complicated, but I'm going to boil it down to just two things. They make money by producing electricity and selling it at a premium, in addition to maintaining the transmission infrastructure for all of our benefit. By now, you may have heard that I believe the generation side is going towards a marginal cost of zero. And so that's getting a little out of their hands. It's the transmission side, however, that still, there's a lot going on. And if we just look at the transmission side of things, we can see that the costs in the US range from anywhere from just over 2 cents per kilowatt hour all the way to over 15 cents per kilowatt hour. Now, 15 cents is more than 1.5 times what we pay for our all-in electricity costs. So there is a huge room for improvement, and things like distributed energy generation will all play a role in this, but that's a topic for a different talk. Now, I only just saw this quote probably about a month ago, and it really resonated with me. The best restaurant in the world is never a buffet. It is only through extreme focus that you can excel in any specific area. And I believe the utility of the future has a real opportunity to focus on this transmission side and do an amazing job at it. Those who don't, I fear, may fall to obsolescence. So solar coming in at close to 2 cents per kilowatt hour is an amazing thing. But 2 cents per kilowatt hour is a pretty interesting number because the most important 2 cents in today's conversation is your 2 cents. Today, the regulatory and policy frameworks are being put in place that will either expedite this process or put stumbling blocks in the way. Today, you've heard what I believe, but it's more important that policymakers hear what you believe, no matter what side of the coin you come down on. Thank you.